Hello again, and welcome to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. We're going to do something a little bit different this episode, share some highlights from a special event we hold every year, bringing journalists to the Lincoln Institute for 2 days of training and conversation. This spring, we had about 30 reporters and editors on the climate beat, and we framed the discussion around the topic of land and the climate crisis. It's not always readily apparent how land and land use factors into the response to global warming, but land is threaded through just about every corner of the crisis, whether it's deforestation, land conservation for carbon sequestration, land, water, and agriculture, and of course the fact that usable land is disappearing with flooding, sea level rise, wildfires, and mudslides, raising the important question of where so many people will go now and in the future. We also talked about how land will need to be better managed through tax policy and planning and regulation because powerful private market forces are at work, in many cases swooping in and buying land that will be prime and prized for the coming time of rising temperatures, a classic case of real estate speculation happening right in front of us. The journalists were welcomed by George Mac McCarthy, president of the Lincoln Institute, who spelled out the enormity of the task ahead, noting that the global consulting firm McKinsey estimates that the transition to net zero emissions could cost around $275 trillion in public and private investment in new energy and land use systems over the next 3 decades. For comparison, McCarthy writes in the most recent issue of Landlines magazine, in today's dollars, we spent around $500 billion to build the U.S. interstate highway system, around $180 billion to rebuild Europe in the 2 decades after World War II, $675 billion to fund the New Deal in the 1930s, and $850 billion for the American Recovery Act in the decade after 2009. The recently signed Inflation Reduction Act dedicates almost $275 billion for climate and clean energy initiatives. So it's a big challenge that's going to cost a lot of money. And McCarthy said, land is and is going to continue to be a big part of it.
So why do we bring you here? Well, we bring you here because we need to elevate, in some ways, the understanding of the important role that land plays and will play in our ability to address this existential crisis. And if we get it wrong, we're going to leave a planet that's very, very different for whomever is left to exist on it than there is today. And the big question is, are we prepared to and can we navigate between the really, really powerful claims, private claims over dominion over land in exchange for the collective needs to use land differently to get to better global outcomes? Everything kind of hangs in the balance.
One big first step in better land use management going forward might be consideration of some form of a land tax, like the one in use in Taiwan. But there's going to be even more challenges ahead in terms of land and climate. One of the first things we all learned was just how much competition and conflict there is over land, not just for real estate development, but over the siting of wind and solar facilities or hydropower transmission pipelines, conflicts over what places should be utterly left alone as natural ecosystems, and land that should be used for more efficient agriculture. This all ups the game for conflict resolution and negotiation and getting to yes, according to Ona Ferguson, who joined us from the Consensus Building Institute. Working with local communities on such tough topics as sea level rise requires taking a planetary problem and figuring out how people can become invested in action at that local level, she said.
So the approach, the piece that I think we have to offer in our work related to all of this is about the scale of the decisions that are made around land. So the climate situation is broad. We all know the time horizons are big. The information is high scale. But so many of the decisions on land use are made at even a neighborhood level, right? A building by building level, community level. And for those decisions to make sense, they have to involve the people there. You can't really do it top down.
Next, we zeroed in on land, water, and agriculture. Author Michael Grunwald set the stage for the discussion by reminding us that only 1% of land on Earth is taken up by people, cities, and civilization.
The Earth is its farms and its nature, mostly pastures and nature. But the future land competition, with all due respect to all of us who have spent a lot of time thinking about these urban issues, it really is going to be about agriculture, which, as many of you know, is the largest user of fresh water. It's going to be a competition between ag and nature. We do still have to feed the world, though. And on the current trend, if you look at population, we're going to have nearly 10 billion people by 2050, and we're going to need about 20 quadrillion calories. Right now, we produce about 13 quadrillion. So that means we're going to need to increase agriculture. Is going to have to produce an additional, comes out to about the equivalent of 800 Olive Garden breadsticks per person per year. Additional, if we continue our yield trends. So in other words, it's going to be really hard. We're going to need a lot more food. And for all the reasons we heard during the last panel, we're also going to need a lot more nature to store the carbon to save us, which is a long way of saying that land really matters.
The need to change the way we use land and water for agriculture is playing out in real time in the Colorado River Basin, where climate change has arrived with a vengeance, and where there's been a 23-year drought, all at a time of big population increases in urban areas served by the river. All the Colorado Basin states are struggling right now with cuts in water supply. But as Bruce Babbitt, former governor of Arizona and former Interior Secretary, pointed out, some 75% of the water is for irrigated agriculture.
Now, what does that do for agriculture? There are 4 million acres of irrigated agriculture in the 7 states and Mexico. 4 million acres. The river is already declined by 20%, fully used. And we've been living off the storage that's accumulated in Lake Mead, Lake Powell, and the big reservoirs, which are now approaching what's known as dead pool, the point at which they are no longer part of the water supply. Now, if you add those figures, you get an inescapable conclusion that of the 4 million acres of irrigated agriculture in the 7 states and Mexico of the Colorado River Basin, 1 million acres of agriculture have to be taken out of production. 1 million acres. The process is already underway in its beginning stages, and it's not a happy process. You can see it in southern Arizona, where random reductions are made in small agricultural communities, pretty much as a function of a lot of legal complexities as to who has to give up the water first, or who has the least secure water rights. And you can go out on the land and see these communities, most of them small communities dedicated to irrigation agriculture, beginning to become ghost towns. Now, for the purpose of water, land use, agriculture, and people on the land, the interesting and important question, it seems to me, is do you let 1 million acres disappear to vacant land and populated by ghost towns? Or do we have the capacity as planners to think of a better way to reduce the footprint of irrigated agriculture by 1 million acres?
One approach, the mission of the Lincoln Institute's Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy, is to better integrate land planning and the management of water resources, something that somewhat incredibly hasn't been the practice over the 20th century. Another is to look at crops that aren't so water-intensive or thirsty, moving them elsewhere, or using technology to irrigate them more efficiently. And yet another is to find new ways to grow food using less land and less water, something that Naveen Sika, CEO of Terviva, walked us through. His startup has been successful planting a hardy tree known as pongomia that can essentially be a substitute for soybeans and oils in food production. What about the other part of the equation? The land not used to feed the world, but left alone in its natural state, protected and conserved, so it can soak up carbon and cultivate biodiversity. Here's Mark Anderson, scientist with the Nature Conservancy, making the point that these natural areas are incredible climate change fighting machines, and yet the world is laying waste to these ecosystems at an alarming rate.
So we're living on this planet with these other organisms, these other forms of life that have developed for millions, almost billions of years in order to take carbon out of the atmosphere. That's what they do. And their whole life is tailored to removing carbon, using carbon, sharing carbon. And it seems to me like that's the most natural partner we have in our fight against climate change. We should be working with trees, using their ability to do this to our own advantage to the degree that we can. It's the fastest, cheapest possible solution to removing carbon from the atmosphere. We can come up with these highly technological things I won't go into, but they're expensive and they're slow and the science is undeveloped. And here we are already living with these forests and grasslands and bogs and mangroves, all plants do this, that have developed their lifespan around extracting carbon.
At COP26 in Glasgow, 141 national leaders pledged to end deforestation by 2030. That followed the Biden administration's 30 by 30 America the Beautiful commitment to conserve 30% of U.S. land and water, over 720 million acres by 2030. Another encouraging policy is promoting the practice of land conservation through conservation easements and land trusts, the subject of a Lincoln Institute report also published this spring. After an evening with Ron Suskind, co-producer of the film Don't Look Up, we started day 2 of the Journalist Forum with a look at the Biden administration's climate agenda. We're joined by Bill McKibben from Middlebury College, who said popular support for doing something about climate change was growing not just among young people, but aging boomers in many other constituencies. Andrew Wieshnia, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation, walked us through some of the plans for infrastructure investments that have been defined by sustainability goals. And then we turn to the necessary subject of how to pay for climate action, and one method in particular, land value capture. Some background on how that works. When governments make investments or otherwise take action on both climate mitigation and adaptation, that increases values for private land and property owners. The Lincoln Institute recently commissioned some research showing exactly that, looking at property values and how they steadily increased after several years of a clean air initiative in Zhengzhou, China. This is Erwin van der Krappen from Radboud University in the Netherlands, who was part of that team doing the analysis.
There's a negative impact on land value as well, because the value of land depends on what you build on it and on what the value is of what you built on it. So bringing all the data together, what we found here is that there's a significant impact of air pollution on property prices in this city, and we did this for all the cities as well in China. We can claim that if air pollution would be reduced with 10%, that leads to an increase in land values of 5%, which is quite substantial.
His point was that a cleaner city is a more valuable city, just like land protected from flooding and sea level rise is more valuable land. If governments can harness just a portion of those increased land values and plow it back into further investments, we get what he and others call a virtuous cycle. Developers in Boston have already recognized this, by the way. They're contributing to a fund to build resilience in the city's Seaport District. That was the report from Brian Golden, recently retired director of the Boston Planning and Development Agency. Finally, one of the most compelling and frankly emotional conversations that took place at the Journalist Forum was about land vanishing, the inevitable reality that some land is going to become uninhabitable or underwater, and that people are going to have to move. We talked about the idea of managed retreat and whether it was even appropriate to use that term, and how climate migration is so fraught with fairness and equity issues, even as some Americans move or remain in harm's way to areas of high risk for flooding, fire, and drought, and in so doing perpetuate emissions-intensive land use. Virtually all the public policy relative to climate migration and buyouts and relocation is a bit ad hoc at the moment, according to Rachel Cletus from the Union of Concerned Scientists.
So climate risks colliding with each other, and also with things like pandemics, wars, food shortages, poverty. So in this moment, it's not enough to be reactive. We absolutely cannot just have a disaster, short-term crisis mindset, because that leads to the worst outcomes. It leads to maladaptation. It leads to stripping human rights and agency from people who are at the most acute end of this crisis. So it's wrenching on a human level, completely wrenching that we have pushed some people and places to these limits, but we have to get out ahead of it. Our policies, our stakeholder processes, our human rights centered frameworks have to get out ahead of it. Otherwise, we're going to push many, many more people to just be on the move in crisis.
The moderator of this session, author Alexandra Tempest, recalled how some efforts at adaptation and resilience can have very unintended consequences.
Thank you. Yeah, this reminds me of a story I heard from a woman in Austin who I was interviewing the other day, and she is a community organizer and resident in Dove Springs, which is a neighborhood on the edge of gentrification in Austin, which, as we all know, is a very rapidly gentrifying area. And there's a creek that runs through that neighborhood that was getting persistent flooding, and they had 2 especially devastating disasters in the neighborhood. And it's a low-income neighborhood. It's mostly Spanish-speaking people of color that live there. And when this flooding happened, the buyout program that came to the neighborhood ended up resulting in people who were flooded were bought out, sometimes not on the best terms, and then moved away. And now what's there is when there's a FEMA buyout program, I'm sure some of you know, there's a requirement to leave that land open and free of permanent indoor structures so that we don't replicate the flood loss. So now it's a park space, which on its surface sounds great. You know, we've removed people from flooding danger. Now there's an open green space that we all can enjoy and it can safely flood again. However, she said, this park is really painful to me because now this area is being gentrified and people are coming here, people with money are moving in, and they see it as just this nice, pretty park. Oh, look how beautiful and peaceful it is. And actually, it's a place where people were displaced from their homes, and now people with more money are moving in, and they might not be living on the side of that park.
At the Journalist Forum this spring, we also looked at some practical tools to help cover the story of the century, led by Jeff Allenby at the Center for Geospatial Solutions and Peter Callahan from the Internet of Water Initiative, both new Lincoln Institute programs. Advances in technology have enabled essentially a real-time dashboard to monitor land use changes and water flows, and that serves as a critical foundation for planners and policymakers and journalists telling the story of this turbulent time. And finally, we talked about the business of climate journalism itself, joined by Nancy Gibbs, director of the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School, Andrew McCormick from the coverage collaborative Covering Climate Now, Amrita Gupta from the Earth Journalism Network, and Trish Wilson, who established the first climate team dedicated to the coverage of global warming at the Washington Post. Here at the Lincoln Institute, we're going to continue to focus on the climate crisis and look forward to working with journalists all over the world who are committed to covering this critical and unfolding story. For more information on all our climate work and to check out Landlines magazine, just go to the website lincolninst.edu. Also follow us on Twitter. The handle is @landpolicy. That is it for this special episode of the Land Matters podcast. We hope you'll rate and subscribe and tell all your friends. Anyone concerned about climate change and how to address it will be interested in this show. So until next time, I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Thanks for listening.